Here to discuss it in studio, Lisa Ruth, former CIA analyst, currently an analyst for Lignet, and also our friend Skyping in from Washington, D.C., Fred Fleitz, the chief analyst from Lignet. To you both, thanks very much for your time this morning. And Fred, let's begin with you. When we read these articles about an incursion of airspace, is it something that should concern us in terms of threats and our threshold for threats? What do you make of this talk about Russians coming into our airspace?
I think it's a real concern, and it's a trend that we've been seeing over the last few years of Russia under Vladimir Putin's leadership increasingly challenging the United States. And there's a direct tie to what's going on in Ukraine. Putin, what's going on in Ukraine, he doesn't like American support for the Ukrainian government. And he's basically still acting as a wild card and making us wonder, will Russia invade eastern Ukraine? And are these incursions by Russian bombers a sign that we shouldn't take him for granted?
Lisa Ruth, to that point, we have spoken before about, is this the rise of a neo-Soviet Union? And people say, not really, but it is inherent in terms of an expansionist Russian policy. It may be a little different, but your take on what we've been hearing.
You know, I completely agree with Fred. What you've got is a strong man. I mean, we keep going back to that term. Here's somebody who has no hesitation, flexing his muscles, whatever terminology you want to use, and he likes to let us know he's unhappy. He's still unhappy with U.S. support for Ukraine, and he's going to continue to push those margins. He's not at all demure about that. He's going to continue to push.
And with that push, this week, can we expect the Russians to cross that border, or is that trying to put too fine a timeline on it? Fred, what's your take on that?
Well, Western policy, Putin is not going to do that. He's amassed a large number of troops on the border with Ukraine. The Ukrainian army seems to be in the final stages of taking over these separatist regions in the east of the country. Every day that goes by suggests that Putin is not going to intervene, but this is really an affront to his leadership, both at home and on the international stage. And there's many experts who think he may invade. I'm beginning to think he won't, but I don't think it's off the table.
What about your take, Lisa?
Yeah, I'm not going to put my money on a date of this week or any other time. I think he'd rather not go in. Where we are is he's very smart. He's not going to go in if he can help it. And I agree with Fred. It almost depends on the day, depending on how things change. But I think he will try to avoid it if he can. I'm not prepared to say this week, but I also don't think if he went in, I wouldn't be completely shocked either.
Well, we need to shift our attention back to what's going on in Iraq in terms of the continuing threat from ISIS. We mentioned earlier that the U.S. has agreed to supply weapons to the Kurds. I understand some of those weapons are getting there. If that's the case, we need to understand who is actually supplying those weapons. Is it the Defense Department, or if not, technically the Defense Department, Fred, who is supplying those weapons? I don't know if Fred is frozen there. It's not that he was hesitating.
I lost you for a second there, JD.
Oh, good. We've renewed our contact. Just wondering about the reports of weapons getting from the U.S. to the Kurds. We're wondering who is supplying those. Is it from our Defense Department, or exactly what entity would be supplying those weapons to the Kurds?
Well, they're from the Defense Department, and what's good about this is that we're finally providing the weapons directly to the Kurds. We're not going through the government in Baghdad. Now, I wrote a piece for Lignet that was published yesterday that said that this is a policy shift that really needs to be made immediately, and I'm happy the Obama administration did that.
And to see this shift in priorities, Lisa, not only most welcome, but in terms of the Kurds, how long have they been asking for this type of support?
For months, at least for months. And the shift is really important. I think it gives us support to the allies, the people who most need it and who are most organized right now. The Iraqi military is kind of a mess as well. And I think this is also important. And we've already seen the airstrikes have helped the Kurds, but I also think probably the weapons are also helping them retake some towns.
Well, as we see this going on and finally weapons getting to the Kurds, we talked about the unreliable Iraqi military, and unreliable, perhaps that's the term we should use for the political structure of governance right now in Iraq. Fred, how is this going to play out? We're hearing that segments of the military loyal to Maliki is basically now surrounding the green zone. What is the latest? How do you see this playing out?
Well, that's exactly right. Let me first add that this operation we're doing to help the Kurds is extremely limited, and I don't think it's going to defeat ISIS. But concerning the situation in Baghdad, there were concerns over the weekend that Prime Minister Maliki was mounting a coup. He deployed military forces in Baghdad, and that was because the new president, who is a Kurd, under the Iraqi system, the president is a Kurd, the president position is mostly ceremonial, the prime minister has to be a Shiite. The president was going to appoint someone other than Maliki. And this is to get around an impasse. There's 328 seats in the Iraqi parliament. You need 165 to form a government. Maliki has about 93 seats. No other alliance has more than 25. This means Maliki is in the driver's seat to form the new government. Last time it took 10 months to form a government under Maliki. The new Kurdish president, Fuad Massam, is trying to get around this by choosing another Shiite in Maliki's coalition. Maliki has not mounted a military operation yet to stay in power. He's only mounted a legal challenge. Within the last hour, the Associated Press said that Haider al-Abidi, a member of the Iraqi parliament, has been named the new prime minister. We're waiting to see what Maliki will do.
And Lisa, that as Fred sets this up, will Maliki go gently into that sweet good night, or do you expect more of a fight? When you hear coup bandied about, that adds to the problem here.
I think he'll retain some power. Keep in mind, and again, I'm very curious to hear Fred's view, he is still Minister of Defense and Minister of Interior. He does retain power. He does retain the loyalty of some segments. I don't think he's going to go away completely. I don't know that he's going to challenge for the prime minister, although, again, I don't think that's out of question, but I do think he'll retain power in a new government.
Well, Fred, let's get your take. Lisa wants it. What role does Maliki take on in this new government?
Right now, I don't think Maliki is going to have the political and military support to stay in government. I think he's going to try to negotiate leaving power with some type of immunity for the various things he did as prime minister, some of the sectarian attacks on Sunnis. But I believe he will probably leave power completely, but he'll have some type of immunity. But there's still the possibility he's going to use his control over the armed forces to stay in power. I don't think that's going to happen, but we may know the answer to that question by the end of today.
Well, we'll keep our eyes on that. Of course, so many eyes turning to what's been happening in the north of the country in terms of the persecution of Christians and other religious sects. ISIS, what is your take? You mentioned earlier the aid and the airstrikes offered. Fred, is it just too little too late?
Well, these airstrikes are defensive in nature. They are to help for humanitarian purposes, to protect religious minorities and U.S. personnel. This is going to have an effect, a positive humanitarian effect, and the president deserves credit for that. This is not going to significantly slow ISIS. We need an offensive operation of airstrikes against military targets, supply lines, and this also means we're going to have to attack ISIS in Syria. If we don't do that, this is simply not a serious operation, and ISIS will continue to make gains across the country. Right now, we're only attacking ISIS in small areas, only in northern Iraq.
Lisa, it's been termed as pinpricks. Do you think the attacks will pick up in force and ferocity?
I agree with Fred again. I hope so, because I do think what we're doing right now, I do think it's too little too late. I think that we will provide some humanitarian relief. I think it's a positive sign that we're doing something, finally. But I also think that this is very, very small. And unless it expands, I think ISIS will continue. The Syria part is very interesting because it provides an escape valve. If we're not going to cut them off in Syria, there's no sense in doing this.
Less than a minute, quick answer to you both. A new ceasefire between Israel and Hamas. Fred, do you see that holding for 72 hours?
I think it's likely to hold for 72 hours, but I don't think the prospects for a peace settlement are good, and the fighting will probably resume this week.
Last word to you, Lisa.
Absolutely agree. Let's hope for the 72 hours, but I don't think it's going to be forever.
Fred Fleitz, Lisa Ruth, we thank you for your insights and analysis, and as always, for in-depth analysis of all these subjects we've covered and more. Please go to lignet.com. Oh, coming up, stateside, who is the real Charlie Crist? His opponent wants Floridians to be asking the same question after Crist's recent party change. We'll go in depth with conservative talk show host Joyce Kaufman. That's coming up on America's Forum.